Guys, this is a reaction video to discuss some of the goings on the Frank Warren Box Nation BT Sports side of boxing. As a lot of you will be aware, there was an extended press conference today where Frank Warren announced numerous fights across several dates and laid some of the groundwork for his 2017 schedule of boxing. If you guys are active on social media, particularly if you guys are active on Twitter, and if you are active on Twitter as a boxing fan, do give me a follow on Twitter at Boxing Gossip. But if you are active on Twitter, you'll have noticed yesterday that there was an incredible amount of hype about this press conference. We were expecting major announcements. Peter Fury, in particular, put out a tweet tagging in his son, Hughie Fury, and tagging in Billy Joe Saunders, saying that they were very much looking forward to the announcement, to the press conference that they would be attending the next day. So speculation was rife as to what this press conference would involve. A number of boxing fans, including a number of those who are connected to me on Facebook, believed we were likely to have a world title announcement between Huey Fury and Joseph Parker, and a world title announcement between Billy Joe Saunders and whoever it was Billy Joe Saunders will be fighting. Those were not announced, which we'll come to later on in this video, but potentially disappointing, as from my standpoint, I see those two as the potential marquee fighters for Box Nation and BT Sports. Huey Fury, a heavyweight, a very famous surname in boxing at the minute, a guy who is one fight away from the heavyweight championship of the world. Billy Joe Saunders, possibly Frank Warren's best known boxer, a world champion, a guy who defeated Chris Eubank Jr., who's subsequently gone on to become one of the biggest names in British boxing. So potentially slightly disappointing that those two guys weren't announced in fights. As I say, we'll come to that in a bit further detail later on. But Frank Warren has said further fights will be added to these bills. So we're going to start April the 8th at the Manchester Arena. Terry Flanagan will defend his world title against Petrov. Petrov's first name, Petr Petrov. I'm sorry if I've murdered that pronunciation. There's some suggestion that if Huey Fury versus Joseph Parker were to be made, that fight would be added to this bill. And if it were added to this bill, that would add certainly a lot of value. As a co-main event, if you like, Liam Smith versus Liam Williams. And let me say, this video isn't going to be overwhelmingly positive about today's announcements. However, credit when due, that's a fantastic fight. That is a great fight. What it is not is a fight that is going to appeal to the casual fans. My casual fan mates who, don't really follow boxing and, maybe know Anthony Joshua, maybe know David Haye, maybe know Chris Eubank Jr. and Amir Khan. They're not going to be sitting on their sofas rubbing their hands at the prospect of Liam Smith versus Liam Williams. These are not guys who have crossed over from the hardcore fans to the to the casual fans. But as hardcore boxing fans, as UK fans, we know this is legit a great fight, and it's one that I am massively looking forward to. Credit to Liam Smith for taking the fight. Liam Smith, as you guys know, coming off the biggest fight of his career, a defeat to Canelo Alvarez, and he's going straight back into the lion's den against Liam Williams. I actually suspect Liam Williams may start this fight as a favourite. I could have got that wrong. I've not seen any betting odds, but that would be my suspicion. And if that's the case, credit to Liam Smith. Liam Smith's just taken a big loss. It would be very easy for him to come back, have 2 or 3 comeback fights on undercards, flying under the radar, and try and rebuild for a world title fight. But that's not what Liam Smith has done here. On the contrary, in fact, Liam Smith has stepped straight into another big fight, a 50-50 fight with the highly rated Liam Williams. And I do rate Liam Williams very highly. Very highly. He's a hard hitter. He can box. He's an aggressive guy. He was involved in a great fight last year with Gary Corcoran. A great fight last year. And if anything, that fight showed one weakness in Liam Williams, which is that he sometimes negates his boxing, and he is the kind of guy who you can suck into a scrap, which is always always a worry. It's always a worry, that is, when somebody can potentially abandon their game plan and their boxing. But these two guys are very, very good light middleweights. These two guys are guys who don't tend to take a back foot step. Liam Smith is the archetypal presser fighter type. He stalks opponents, he throws to the body, he puts punches together inside the pocket. Liam Williams, more of a boxer puncher, but with a scrapper's mentality and power to burn. These are guys who come forward. This is going to be a good fight. This could develop into a fight of the year contender. It really could. And I don't just say that because of the styles involved. I believe these are two high-class guys. Look, neither of them are at the elite at this stage. The levels were shown when Liam Smith fought Canelo. And Liam Williams did have a tough fight against Gary Corcoran. We're not talking about the number 1 and number 2 light middleweight in the world here. Could we be talking about the number 1 and number 2 light middleweight in Britain? Very possibly. There's skill on show, there's class on show. I think this is a great fight. The Flanagan versus Petrov fight, for me, a tad disappointing. I'll have to speak to Jet on the podcast on Wednesday as our lower weight class correspondent to get a full run through on Petrov. Petrov was actually rated slightly higher on BoxRec than I suspected. He was 10th in the world on BoxRec, and I look back at some of his record and there's some names on there. He's beaten a few fighters. He lost to Dazan Zlatikanen. He was stopped early, I believe, by Marcus Maidana. And there's bits and pieces of form on his resume, so I'm sure Jet will have seen him in more detail than I have, and I'll ask Jet for a take on how much competition this guy is. But let's be honest, when we were thinking of the dream fights we'd like to be Terry Flanagan in, how many of us were sitting at home on our sofas going, I want Flanagan to fight Petr Petrov. And for me, this is one of the problems with Terry Flanagan's career. A lot of people out there believe Terry Flanagan is the number 1 lightweight in the world. I know a number of people in boxing who I respect really, really, really rate Terry Flanagan. I think Irish Tom on the podcast really rates Terry Flanagan. I know Ultratech Sport is a massive, massive Terry Flanagan fan. People rate Flanagan very, very highly. But fights like this are just, this is not building him commercially. You look at how Anthony Crolla was managed last year, and you compare and contrast it to Terry Flanagan, and it's just worlds apart. And here, fighting him against Petrov, a fight that nobody was calling for, a fight that very few people are going to be excited for. Fighting him against Petrov at this stage, for me, is a missed opportunity. It's a missed opportunity. Surely there could have been more glamorous matchups up there. And let's be honest, this fight is probably going to be overshadowed by Liam Smith versus Liam Williams. Flanagan, he's not one of those fighters who is the most instantly eye-catching in the ring. He's not a massive puncher. He's kind of more of a technician. He's quite defensively minded. Surely to build, he's not, let's be honest as well, Flanagan isn't the greatest character outside the ring. He isn't the most marketable guy. Surely to build his profile, we need to see him in either domestic matchups or we need to see him in, the big fights. And this is the opposite of that. So that's the April the 8th bill at the Manchester Arena. Still some rumours circulating that Hughie Fury will join that bill. And let's have it right. If the bill is Hughie Fury, Joseph Parker, Flanagan Petrov, Smith Williams, if that's what the bill looks like, then it's a 9 out of 10 bill. It's a 9.5 out of 10 bill. But if it's just those two fights with a host of undercard fighters, for me, it's a 6.5 to 7 out of 10 bill. And largely the reason I even give it that much credit is because I'm buzzing for Liam Smith versus Liam Williams. We brought up Huey Fury, so let's touch on Huey Fury briefly. I, as you guys know, am a massive Team Fury fan. I have been a massive, massive fan of Tyson Fury. I have hyped Huey Fury all the way on this channel. I've covered pretty much all of Huey Fury's fights on this channel. I'm one of his biggest fans. But the way Peter Fury is generating hype around Hughie Fury has really turned me into a non-believer at this stage. The amount of times we have heard about Hughie Fury's next fight, the amount of times we've heard it's going to be a top 10 opponent, all of Peter Fury's tweets hyping this press conference. And what was the announcement re Hughie Fury? The announcement regarding Hughie Fury was that they are in talks with Joseph Parker's promoters. I actually received an email from Joseph Parker's promoters the other day. Did I feel the need to call a press conference over it? No, I didn't. Being in talks with Joseph Parker's promoters is not newsworthy. It's not something that needs to be hyped via Twitter, because you're the mandatory challenger for Joseph Parker's belt. Of course you're going to be in talks with the promoters. Now, if the fight gets made, all well and done, but the amount of times we've seen Huey Fury against Andy Ruiz, that fight not happening. Huey Fury's next opponent will be a top 10 opponent, and it hasn't happened. I understand there's been complicating factors. There's been factors relating to drug testing outside the ring. There's been factors relating to cuts. There's been factors relating to Huey Fury's health and illness and acne. We all know about that. But there was just no need to raise expectations that a big announcement was coming for this press conference. There was no need to raise expectations and imply that Huey Fury versus Joseph Parker could be made for this press conference. It was pointless. I've said it time and time again on this channel. Why raise expectations if you were just going to break them? If they hadn't mentioned Huey Fury with reference to this press conference, no one would be disappointed that Huey Fury versus Joseph Parker hadn't been made. But yet again, expectations have been set here, and the delivery is usually here. Today it's down there. Today we have heard that Huey Fury and his team have heard from Joseph Parker's promoters. It means literally nothing. I hope the fight gets made. I'm a massive fan of Huey Fury outside of the ring. Some of the hype surrounding him, I was listening to Ultratech Sports video the other day talking about, and he made some good points about how Huey Fury, Joshua was on the horizon. All of this hype around Huey Fury has become meaningless, and it's getting to the point where it goes over my head now. And I'm a massive fan of boxing. I'm a massive Team Fury fan, and I'm a massive Huey Fury fan. So you can probably sense the frustration there. But the suggestion is that Huey Fury could potentially be added to the bill against Parker. If he is, it's a great bill. Parker Fury world title fight, Flanagan Petrov world title fight, top draw domestic action, Smith versus Williams. I would have no complaints about that bill. Without Fury Parker, you've got a great fight in Smith Williams, and for me, another disappointing missed opportunity to raise Terry Flanagan's profile. Let's move it on. April the 22nd at the Leicester Arena. Tommy Langford versus Craig Cunningham, known to my channel as the guy who defeated Anthony Wake Me Up Before You Go. It's a decent fight. It's for the British title. Understand Jack Armfield will potentially be making his way towards the winner of this fight later on the year. Craig Cunningham really impressed me against Anthony Ogogo. I appreciate that Cunningham is more of a light middleweight than a middleweight, and I appreciate that Langford is a very big middleweight. Clearly, there's going to be a size difference at play here. However, I also believe there's going to be a skill difference at play. Cunningham impressed me against Ogogo. He could move. Not just move in terms of his feet, but move in terms of his head movement, move in terms of his upper body movement. He's slippery, he's awkward, he's a bit slick. Cunningham really impressed me against Ogogo. I had Cunningham winning wide on my card at the time of the stoppage in that Ogogo fight. Tommy Langford, for me, I've got the opposite opinion of him. I've never been a fan of Tommy Langford. I believe he's a very overrated fighter. Stiff, robotic, plodding. All of these are kind of words that I would use to describe Tommy Langford. And I think I'm sure he was very disappointed. I think he actually got a very lucky escape that Chris Eubank Jr. fight didn't happen, because I believe that could have been very damaging to Tommy Langford had it occurred. This fight, it's a good matchup. I actually quite like the fight. I think Langford's size is going to be a big factor, but I side with Craig Cunningham in this fight, and I understand Langford will probably be the favourite. I just think the way to beat Tommy Langford is to bring a very similar style to what Craig Cunningham's going to bring. And I think the way Craig Cunningham danced around the ring against a go-go, the way he made a go-go constantly miss with that jab, the way he was able to sort of bob and weave and frustrate, I think that's the perfect style to beat Tommy Langford. And I suspect that if Craig Cunningham turns up in as good a form as he was against a go-go that night, I suspect that Craig Cunningham probably beats Langford. Again, look, this is a fight, a British level fight. It's a good fight. I'm looking forward to it. It's not a world title action fight. Similarly, on the undercard, as a co-main event, I guess, you have Tyrone Nurse defending his British title against Joe Hughes. Now, let's discuss this briefly. Tyrone Nurse is a guy who I rate very highly. I actually find his style very, very entertaining. I think he's got large upside in the sport. He's someone who I would like to see moved above British title level relatively swiftly. Now, Tyrone Nurse is one of two fighters, the other being Josh Warrington, who we'll come to later on in this video, who I think is a key acid test for Frank Warren's new deal with BT Sports and Box Nation as to what Frank can actually deliver for fighters at that sort of level. Tyrone Nurse, I actually think Eddie Hearn on the whole was doing a good job of promoting Tyrone Nurse. I understand they didn't have a formal deal, it was maybe a bit more ad hoc, but if you look at Tyrone Nurse's box rec, his last fight, a win against Tommy Coyle. Prior to that, a win against Willie Limond. Prior to that, a win against Chris Jenkins. These are good British level fighters that Tyrone Nurse was going out and getting the job done against. He's now fighting Joe Hughes, which for me, I understand Tyrone Nurse probably wants to stay at British level, he probably wants to win the belt outright, etc. I personally would like to see him push more towards world level. But, Joe Hughes is arguably a step back. Specifically in terms of profile, Chris Jenkins, Willie Limond, Tommy Coyle, as far as I'm concerned, they're all bigger names. So it's slightly perplexing, that Tyrone Nurse has gone straight into a fight which potentially represents a step back in terms of his profile being built. Even though I do understand you've got to take certain fights if you're going to continue to fight at British title level. So, yeah, that fight for me, not one I'm massively up for. I suspect Tyrone Nurse will be a substantial favourite in that fight. On the undercard of that, so this is April the 22nd still, so you've got Langford versus Craig Cunningham, Nurse versus Hughes. On the undercard, you've got Vijender Singh versus Jermaine Smile. Now, I'm going to do a separate video on that because I understand a lot of people on my channel are big Vijender Singh fans, and I actually think there's some interesting points about that fight that I want to go into in detail. But look, we're at this point, we're already 18 minutes in to this video and we're not even half done, so I'll talk about Vijender Singh in a separate video. Let's move on to May the 6th at the Copper Box Arena in London. Now, this is the night where it is suggested Billy Joe Saunders' title fight could potentially be added to the bill. Billy Joe, I've seen him give a few interviews today where he is suggesting that the fight that's going to be announced for him is going to be a very, very, very big name fight. I'm struggling to see who that big name fight is, to be honest, because Golovkin and Jacobs are fighting each other, so realistically it's not one of them. Canelo is got a fight against Chavez, so it's not Canelo. Chris Eubank Jr., as we know, is fighting for the IBO World title coming up very, very soon. So it seems unlikely to be Chris Eubank Jr. So it's a bit bizarre. Like, Billy Joe is suggesting it's a very, very, very big fight. Maybe I'm missing something. If I am, leave it in the comments section below. But who is this likely opponent going to be? I'm unaware. I'm unaware. And if he is to be added to this bill, and there's no suggestion or confirmation that he actually is, it's just rumoured. But how many huge name opponents are going to come over to fight at the Copper Box? I don't know. So the bill so far confirmed Bradley Skeet versus Singleton. Now, Bradley Skeet is a guy similar to Tyrone Nurse, who I'm a big fan of. I'd like to see Bradley Skeet pushed beyond British title level now. Bradley Skeet is a very, very, very good fighter. But this is a key question about Frank's ability to convert these kind of hardcore fighters, the fighters that appeal to the hardcore fans, that maybe don't have the most marketable personalities, that don't have the punching power. How do you convert those fighters into big names? Because, to be honest, I haven't been overly impressed with the job Frank's done with Bradley Skeet. Last year, Bradley Skeet went on to Sky, fought Sam Eggington, and schooled him. Bradley Skeet looked class that night. Class. Since then, Sam Eggington's, gone on to fight Frankie Gavin and beat Frankie Gavin in a Fight of the Year contender. There were rumours that he was offered a fight by Danny Garcia. I know that there are ongoing talks and speculation that he'll fight Paulie Malignaggi. Eggington's career has gone on an upwards trajectory since that loss to Bradley Skeet. Now, Bradley Skeet, who, as we know, was the victor that night, and the victor in quite some fashion, if I say, has subsequently gone on and fought at the undercard, in Cardiff, Wales, and then he's fought at the Brentwood Centre against John Fane. Now he's fighting at the Copper Box against Shane Singleton. Now, Singleton, I would imagine, I've seen him box once or twice. I don't view Singleton as anything like the same sort of level as Bradley Skeet. So it's a fairly routine fight for Bradley Skeet. But you're getting an impression here, like there's a constant theme re-emerging. Flanagan versus Petrov. Is that raising Flanagan's profile? Nurse versus Hughes. Is that raising Nurse's profile? Ooh, not so sure. Bradley Skeet versus Singleton. I just don't see it. If I was Bradley Skeet, I'd be very frustrated that it's Sam Eggington getting the fights against Frankie Gavin, getting the offers from Danny Garcia, getting the rumours with Paulie Malignaggi. Those are the kind of fights that I'd be wanting. On the undercard, Mitchell Smith versus George Jupp. Now, there was a huge upset last year when George Jupp beat Mitchell Smith. I think Jupp's taken a loss himself since. Mitchell Smith has had a comeback fight and won. So, interesting. Mitchell Smith, as we know, now part of the Adam Booth setup. This will be a key test. Mitchell Smith is always a guy I've believed could really get to world level. I think he's a very, very good fighter. Let's see how he deals with George Jupp. Jupp was a taller, rangier guy who stuck the jab out all night. Let's see. Let's see how he does. Very disappointing if he doesn't win that rematch. But it's I think given the nature of what happened the first time round, I applaud the rematch. But let's have a bit of a I said the April the 8th card at Manchester. I said I give that a 9.5 out of 10 if Huey Fury is confirmed against Parker on that. But without that, I give it a 6.5, 7 out of 10 fight. Leicester Arena. Langford, Nurse v Hughes. Let's be honest, these are British title level fights. These are, these are not world level fights. It's not a bad bill. I like watching British title level boxing, but it is what it is. Now, this made a 6th card: Skeet versus Singleton, Smith versus Jupp. That's a weak card for me. That is a weak card for me. There's nothing wrong with it being a small hall show. Copper Box Arena isn't necessarily a small show, don't get me wrong. But, for me, that's a York Hall bill. That's a small hall bill. Skeet, Singleton, Smith, Jupp. I assume the reason they haven't booked it at the York Hall is because they are going to throw extra talent onto that bill. Hopefully it's Billy Joe Saunders. Hopefully it's a good fight. And that will change my opinion. But would I want to sell out 50 quid for a ticket to see Skeet, Singleton or Smith, Jupp? Probably not. Probably not. I've got to be completely honest there. For me, this is based on what we've got so far, that is a bill that could take place in a small hall. And to be honest, Langford, Cunningham, Nurse, Hughes, probably similar sentiments. Moving on. May 13th, First Direct Arena, Leeds. Josh Warrington versus Marco McCulloch, of course. Now, for me, I spoke earlier about Tyrone Nurse being a key test for Frank Warren. They've taken one from Matchroom. Now let's see what they do with it. Let's see how they promote Tyrone Nurse. Let's see what fights they get him. Let's see if they can turn him into a star. Perhaps Tyrone Nurse was feeling undervalued at Matchroom. It's a good test. But not as good a test as what they do with Josh Warrington. Because Josh Warrington probably wasn't feeling undervalued at Matchroom. Josh Warrington had been converted into a headline act. Josh Warrington is a big deal in Leeds. Josh Warrington was selling out arenas, leading Sky Sports shows, becoming like a bit of a Ricky Hatton-esque figure. So Josh Warrington, for me, is a very, very, very key test to see what Frank Warren can offer. And I've got to be honest, I am very disappointed that the first fight announced for Josh Warrington is Marco McGulloch. Let's have it right. Warrington's last fight, when was it now? It was July. This fight, May. So Warrington's going to be out of the ring for 10 months. Now, prior to Warrington leaving Matchroom, who were the guys he was fighting? Joel Bronca, Amagasa. Bronca had some profile after the Selby fight. Amagasa had some profile after the famous Guillermo Rigondo fight. Patrick Hyland had some profile after the Gary Russell Jr. fight. These are all named opponents. Marco McGulloch, for me, is a big, big, big step down. It's a real step down. I've got to say, Marco McGulloch isn't rated in the top 100 on BoxRec. 2 fights ago, he was fighting a guy with a 6-win, 48-loss record. He lost by stoppage to Isaac Lowe in Isaac Lowe's 12th fight. He lost by stoppage to Zoltan Kovacs, who has a 13-5 record in 2015. I'm not saying boxing is a game written on paper, but if you look at Josh Warrington, the guy was selling out arenas, the guy was headlining bills, the guy was fighting named opponents. Hyland, Amagasa, Bronca, those were his last 3 fights. Now he's dropping down a level for me. He's going from guys who've been in world title fights, he's going from guys who've been against the top fighters in the world, and he's dropping down to Marco McGulloch, who isn't in the top 100. It's a disappointing fight for me. And if I was a fighter at Matchroom, currently considering my options and considering whether I was going to take the jump and switch over to join Box Nation BT Sports and Frank Warren, I would be looking very, very closely at the careers of Tyrone Nurse and Josh Warrington, and I would be trying to calculate whether their careers had taken an upwards trajectory or a negative trajectory since making that move. And for me, I know this is only the initial fights, I understand these are long-term prospects, but for me, the initial fights are disappointing, and on both occasions represent a step down in terms of the profile of opponent for the named fighters. Let's talk about, I understand this video is nearly half an hour long already, so I'm going to wrap it up. I'm not going to talk for too much more detail, I promise. One of the key things for me was when this deal was announced between BT Sports, Box Nation, etc. How many times did we hear that there were going to be 30 shows this year? 10 being small hall type shows on Box Nation, 20 of those being on BT Sports. Well, as I understand it, and again, I haven't got access to the full schedule here, so if I've got this wrong, please comment below. But as I understand it, Frank Warren has so far got 2 shows announced in the UK prior to today's announcements. He's now added 4 further shows. So these shows take us through to May 13th. Now, May 13th is, that represents, 4.5 months. So approximately 35 to 40% of the year gone. Now, I'm not saying Frank can't announce additional shows. Maybe the Billy Joe Saunders fight, when that's announced, will be a standalone show. Maybe Hughie Fury versus Joseph Parker, if that is to be announced, will be a standalone show. And obviously those would be very, very strong shows if they were announced, given the headline fighters. But these 30 shows are not yet materialising to me. They're not yet materialising. If you look at the Frank Warren stable, a lot of the talent is wrapped up in these bills. Let's put it this way. We're in January now. Guys like Bradley Skeet and Josh Warrington aren't fighting till May. So they're not realistically going to be able to fight again till August, September time. and that's being really, really optimistic. Where are these 30 shows coming from? Where are these 30 shows coming from? I don't know. I don't know. I always felt that was a very, very ambitious number to aim for 30. And again, it's this case of raising expectations here and delivering there. It creates disappointment. Because if Frank Warren delivers 15 shows this year that are actually quite decent, people are going to be disappointed because they expected 30. So, yeah, I've got some question. I've still, there's a bit of frustration in my mind here. Nicola Adams, quick shout out, has also signed today with Frank Warren. Now, for me, that was a bit of a surprise because whenever I've seen him interviewed on women's boxing, Frank has been, I guess you could say, a little bit down on women's boxing, which, I don't specifically, I'm not someone, if Frank personally doesn't enjoy women's boxing, I respect his right not to enjoy that. I don't think we have to all enjoy women's boxing. And Frank said, I think on interview, he just didn't enjoy seeing women getting punched in the face, and fair enough. So I was surprised to see him sign Nicola Adams today. Clearly, he is looking at what Matchroom are doing with Katie Taylor. And he's trying to get on that bandwagon. We've seen that a few times recently. Matchroom signed Lawrence Okoli. I think it was on the same day Frank announced the signing of a 5-0 cruiserweight prospect. Frank announces Nicola Adams after Katie Taylor's had one or two fights. So, fair play to Frank. I think Katie Taylor's potentially going to fight on that. I think Nicola Adams is potentially going to fight on that Josh Warrington bill in Leeds. And we'll see what Frank does with her. But he's opening himself up to some risk there because the comparisons between the two are going to be obvious. And I suspect Eddie Hearn will do a very, very, very good job of marketing Katie Taylor. Eddie Hearn is very good at that, and I suspect Katie Taylor will become a bit of a star by the end of 2017. And if Nicola Adams' profile is on the floor, then again, Frank Warren's going to have some questions to answer. All in all, look, I don't want to be too down. I'm a bit frustrated that guys like Flanagan, guys like Tyrone Nurse, guys like Bradley Skeet are yet again in fights that simply do not raise their profile. I am. I'm a bit frustrated about that. I think it's a missed opportunity. There are some good fights being made. Smith versus Williams, great fight. Langford versus Cunningham, look, that's a British level fight, but it's an entertaining fight. Mitchell Smith versus Jupp, I applaud the rematch. They're okay fights. But all in all, my sense of watching today's press conference and seeing the announcements was a bit disappointed and a bit frustrated. Number one, the fighters who I think really deserve a push in their career, the guys who really need to have their profiles taken to the next level, the Flanagans, the Nurses, the Skeets, they didn't get the opponents and the fights that are going to allow them to do that. Secondarily, the hype around potential big fight announcements for Hughie Fury and Joseph Parker. I was buzzing. I was on my phone today checking Twitter at work. I was thinking, I wonder if Parker versus Fury's been announced yet. I wonder who Billy Joe's opponent's going to be. I know there's this big press conference today. I was really excited for it. Genuinely, I was looking to getting home from work and making a video saying, Parker Fury is confirmed. I was looking forward to going, Billy Joe Saunders' opponent is XYZ. And once again, the failing to announce those fights at this big press conference and the fact that my expectations were set that, there were potentially big announcements was disappointing. So, I've gone on for way too long. It's a bit of a rant, but that's my take on it all. Good to see the schedule announced. Good to see the BT Sports thing moving forward. Good to see some notable fights in the diary. Am I buzzing for these fights? No, with the exception of Smith versus Williams, which I think is a great fight. Will I be more positive if Billy Joe and Huey Fury's fights are announced in the next week and added to that schedule? Absolutely. Frank's also got some real good prospects in the stable. Is it Lerone Richards, Anthony Yard? He's got some real talent there. So let's hope some of these guys get some airtime. Let's hope some of these guys crop up on the undercards. I saw Leon Woodstock was on the bill in Leicester. He's a guy I rate very highly, a very marketable guy. So, it's not all doom and gloom, but that's just my initial take on these announcements. Leave your comments in the section below, guys. Am I being harsh? Do you agree with me? What do you make of these fights? What is the standout fights for you? Leave your comments. Let's have a bit of a discussion on it in the comments section. If you've enjoyed this video, please take the time to hit the thumbs up button. I'm going to cover all these fights on my channel, so please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out any of the coverage. Many thanks indeed for watching. I really do appreciate it.